Programming and Communications Committee for their work, and the Latino Student Cultural Center, the Northeastern Women's Studies Program, and the NU Bookstore for their co-sponsorship of this program. Please help to support our Meet the Author series by becoming a library supporter today. We're also filming today's event to broadcast on Northeastern's YouTube and iTunes University channels. Moreover, we appreciate your feedback, so please take the time to fill out your comment cards and return them to a library volunteer. The library's Meet the Authors series encourages dialogue on significant contemporary questions and brings together faculty, students, and staff to debate and discuss these issues. Today's topic fits in nicely with Northeastern's continued emphasis on going global. Our author today tells a transcontinental story of Africa, Puerto Rico, and New York. Dahlma Llanos-Figueroa was born in Puerto Rico and raised in New York City. She taught in the New York City school system before becoming a young adult librarian, and so we're especially pleased to welcome her to SNEL today. She has won the Bronx Council on the Arts ACE and Brio Awards, as well as a Literary Arts Fellowship. As we celebrate the 100th anniversary of Co-op at Northeastern, it's exciting to hear more from a writer who has diverse career and personal experiences and use them to inform her storytelling. Please join me in welcoming Dahlma.
Can you hear me? Okay. Thank you all for coming today, and I want to thank the university and the Latino Center and the bookstore for supporting this series. I am particularly pleased to be here today because, well, first of all, I've never read in Boston before, so this is the first and only, so I'm really pleased about that. But I'm also pleased because even though my novel is very specific to a certain time and place, I think it's also very universal. And there are themes that we can find across cultures, themes of mother-daughter relationships, of family secrets, of adversity and overcoming adversity, and what legacies mothers leave to daughters. So without a lot of ado, I think I'll start. It is a novel of 5 generations. I will be reading the beginning, I will be reading the prologue, the beginning of chapter 1 for the first in the series of women, and the beginning of the last, or the 5th section. So from the first reading selection to the second is about 100 years, because the novel travels, encompasses about 100 years. So these are the stories, my stories, their stories, just as they were told to my mother and her mother and hers. They were given to me for safekeeping, and now I give them to you. They may be visions that shimmered on the horizon at sunset on the banks of the River Niger. They may have ridden in the evening song of the coqui in a long ago Puerto Rico, when rich men feasted on the sweetness of sugar cane, the bitterness of coffee, and the hearts of other men. These are the stories of a time lost to flesh and bones, a time that lives only in dreams and in memory. No matter, like a primeval wave, these stories have carried me and deposited me on the morning of today. They are the stories of how I came to be who I am, where I am. Book 1, Fela. A gray braid falling over each shoulder, Tia Josefa stuck her head out of the window of Las Agujas, the embroiderer's cabin located just behind the main plantation house. The wagon returning from town swung around the main house and came to a final halt in the batey of the Hacienda Las Mercedes, a sugar plantation near the northern coast of Puerto Rico. She recognized Romero, the mulatto mayoral, sitting high next to the driver. His shadow crawled over the supplies that filled the wagon behind them. The man wore all black, even under the scorching sun. The brim of his hat, tilted forward, hid his eyes, leaving only his pointy chin and a beak of a nose visible. The bony shoulders under his black cape looked nailed to the blue sky beyond. He gripped his whip, handy, ready. In her day, Tia had seen many black people come and go, but there had been no new ones in a long time. She knew Don Tomas had recently acquired a new parcela and needed more hands to work it into cane fields. One thing Tia knew for sure, where there was more work to be done, it would be black hands who would have to do it. So she stretched her skinny neck to take a good look at the men hoisting the monthly supplies, sacks of flour and rice, bolts of cloth, sides of smoked beef out of the wagons. Then came the rest of the cargo, frightened young boys, stone-faced men, and hesitant women. Almost as an afterthought, they poured out onto the courtyard, brown and slow like molasses, the human purchases of the day. Tia searched for Fela, the tall woman she had heard about and couldn't put out of her mind. She was the last to descend, a young woman in her early 20s. There was something familiar about the girl, but Tia couldn't place it and was too drawn to the scene to think about it for very long. There was much activity in the yard, men unhitching horses, curious children scurrying about, Romero assigning quarters to new slaves. The young woman eyed her surroundings from her height of over 6 feet. The others were herded into the cabins that stretched out beyond the wagons. Fela began to follow when Romero, the overseer, blocked her way and pointed his whip to Las Agujas, where she would be living. The woman stared at him. Vamos, muévete, Tia Josefa heard Romero command. ¿Qué, no me oyes? Or are you as deaf as well as blind, or just another stupid negra sucia? Fela examined him as though he were an unreliable animal. She didn't move. Romero stood directly in front of her and shouted his commands into her face. But the woman Fela held her ground. Never known for patience, Romero snatched up his whip and swung it overhead, but his hand froze midair, the whip swinging impotently in the morning breeze. Maldita sea, he growled. Fela still hadn't moved. She showed no sign of fear or even apprehension. Romero's arm remained in a frozen position. He looked from his arm to the whip, to his arm again. Confusion and then rage twisted in his face. Finally, Fela turned and walked in the direction he had indicated. As soon as she moved away, his arm dropped. The mayoral recovered from his moment of confusion, Fela making her way up the slope that led to the main house. Romero gathered himself to his full height, adjusting his hold on the whip. He was about to advance on her retreating figure when a commotion suddenly filled the batey. The horses had spooked and reared, toppling supplies that were still being unloaded. Bags of beans exploded under the trampling hooves. Sacks of flour burst into clouds of white, covering the yard with a layer of ghostly powder. Children ran, men cursed, drivers struggled to get the teams of horses under control. Frantic voices filled the air. Corre! Men ran to help. Mira, nena, ven aquí! Women pulled children out of the way. Cuidado! Warnings ran out as huge containers toppled over and spilled cornmeal, olives, and oil on those standing nearby. Ay, Dios mío! A man was pinned under the weight of several sacks of rice. Romero glared at the pandemonium and then back at the woman who was now beyond his whip's reach. Carajo, he yelled. And now I'm going to skip 100 years to her great-granddaughter. who is a child just beginning school in New York City, and this is her first experience. Her name is Elena. Elena was comforted by her father's presence. Oh, I'm sorry. Wrong one. Her name is Carissa. I stood in the front of the room feeling quite proud of myself. I would have the best show and tell of any of my classmates. I waited until the class was absolutely quiet, and then I held out my hand. I opened one finger at a time to add to the mystery. The students snaked their necks to see what I was holding. Then there it was, the black pebble in my hand. Oh, come on, big deal. It's just a rock. No, it isn't, I protested. It's a magical stone. The room was quiet for a moment and then exploded into laughter and loud jeers. Get out of here. There ain't no such thing as magic. What are you, nuts? Yeah, right. Who you kidding? She done flipped out now, miss. Miss Santini clapped her hands and the class settled down. I'm disappointed in you. What did we say about respect for each other's words and actions? We owe Carissa our silence, our attention, and our respect. Just like you want those things when you come up to the front to speak. Is that understood? I always did like Miss Santini. She cleared her throat and turned to me. Go on, Carissa, we're listening. I looked at the class, and then at Miss Santini, and then at the class again. I tried speaking, but my mouth was dry, and my words got glued together, so nothing came out. I tried to swallow, but I couldn't do that either. My heart started beating really fast, not like a clock like it's supposed to, but like a drum. Suddenly, I had to go to the bathroom. My hand closed around my stone. I squeezed and squeezed, hoping that the pressure in my belly would go away. Go ahead, honey. We're all ready now, Miss Santini encouraged. I shook my head and pulled back, all the way back to the blackboard. I couldn't. I just couldn't do this. Miss Santini was kind, really kind. I wanted to please her, but more than anything, I didn't want to be laughed at again. Look at me, honey. You finish your story. I looked into her eyes, puppy eyes, always soft when she looked at me. Then she looked at the class and her eyes changed, menacing and cold. Honey, you go on. She kept her eyes on the class, which was now absolutely quiet. I could still hear my heartbeat. There will be no more interruptions. Well, I mean, that's okay. I'm done. You take your time and tell us. Well, I looked at their faces and could hear the laughter hiding just beyond their pursed lips. I closed my eyes. How could I do this? Well, I was afraid of using the word magic again, so I left out a lot of things, important things. This rock is really old, really old. My great, well, you know, my long ago grandmother, she brought it with her from far away, and it was a gift from her husband. It was passed down from one grandmother to the next until I got it. It's sort of special because it makes me think of them, the grands, even the ones I never got to meet. The end. The class was absolutely quiet when I stopped talking. They looked at me incredulously. One or two sat eyeing Miss Santini, hands pressed against their lips to keep their laughter in. It was supposed to be a 2-minute speech. I must have said just a few sentences. And then I was done. Silence hung in the air. Forever, it seemed. Well, that was a lovely story. A little story, but very interesting. Does anyone have any questions for Carissa? Not one question? Well, thank you for sharing with us. Children, she eyed them as she continued, let's thank Carissa for her lovely story. They all clapped half-heartedly, but I didn't care. At least they weren't laughing. I walked to my seat in the back of the room and shut them all out. I looked at my desk for the rest of the day. I didn't say anything to anybody. The next thing I knew, the dismissal bell was ringing. I gathered my books and got ready to go home. Home. Safety. Quiet. No laughing. I felt a hand on my shoulder and looked up to find Miss Santini standing there. Carissa, I'm feeling a little tired today, and I could use your help. Can you stay for a few minutes and help me close down the room? Mr. Hughes will dismiss the classes. Usually, I loved helping at the end of the day. It made me feel so special, and one of the reasons why I loved my teacher was because she knew it and occasionally singled me out for this task. But today, more than anything else, I wanted to run home. I hesitated. She said, please? I nodded, yes, because I couldn't speak. I was about to get up and begin washing the board when she stopped me. Let's forget about the blackboard for now. I'd like to talk to you for a minute. Is that okay? I said nothing. I'm sorry your feelings were hurt this afternoon. The class was very rude and has a lot to learn about respect for others. I still said nothing. My eyes were burning again. I looked at the hem of my dress because I didn't want to cry. I knew if I looked at her face, I wouldn't be able to hold back the tears. I have a feeling there's more to that story you told us this afternoon. I'd like to hear it. I looked up for the first time. Again, those soft eyes. She folded her hands in her lap and waited for me to start. Really? I started feeling the excitement that had brought me floating into the room that morning. Yes, I would. I'd like to hear the whole thing. I took a deep breath and told her everything I had left out. You know, my stone is magic. It really, really is. It's magic because my long ago grandfather, Emo, he was a wise man and a healer. He told my long ago grandmother that he could put their baby's soul into a stone, and that even if they were separated, the baby would be all theirs and very strong and a very special child. And his wife, my great-great-grandmother, Fela, hid the stone to protect it from the bad men who attacked their village, and she brought it in a secret place from Africa. And the baby girl was born with the knowing and the healing and the dreaming and the knowledge of plants and trees. And after that, the stone was given to every first girl in the family, like me. That's how I just know things. And not just school stuff, but real things, like how people feel and what they have in their hearts and why they're unhappy. I don't know how I know these things, but I do. And I have lots of dreams, and there's a lady in my dreams who tells me things. And sometimes she tries to fool me with disguises, you know, like Halloween. But I know her anywhere, and she comes and she puts colored words in my head, and she teaches me how to weave the words into stories. She says someday I'll be a storyteller, and people will come and listen to my stories. Yes, they will. When I finished, I felt good. I finally got to tell my story my way, and there was no laughter. In fact, Miss Santini hadn't taken her eyes off me the whole time I'd been speaking. That's a really charming story. It really is. But do you remember a few months ago when we talked about the difference between make-believe and real? Something in her voice started to make me feel uncomfortable. We're all agreed that some things are make-believe or fantasy. Remember that word, fantasy? When we were little, we all get those two mixed up. But now you're older, the age where you have to separate the real from the make-believe. Do you understand? I nodded, but then I whispered without looking up. But it really did happen. My mom told me. I'm sure she really believes it. Sometimes stories get passed down from generation to generation, and people forget what was real and what was made up. But I was about to explain, but what she said next made me stop and think. My grandmother did it too. She came from a tiny town in Italy, and she believed in the evil eye. She thought that envious people would take good luck away by just thinking bad thoughts. Now that's just superstition, right? Some people still believe in stories that they brought over from the old country, like Italy or Greece or Spain or Africa. But we're Americans now, modern and educated. Here, we believe in science. No need for superstitions here. That's what we call progress. Oh, the word kind of dropped out of me. So when you told us about the rock, that was just a story. Or do you really think that rocks are magical? I guess maybe it was just a story then, I said, crestfallen. Yes, that's right. Now maybe you can bring something else next time that shows something truly real that represents our world today. She gave me a warm smile and a big hug. I should have felt wonderful, but I felt like I had just lost something. That night, my lady came to visit me in my dreams. She walked in the forest, the moon and the stars shining so that I could see her clearly, even at night. She came out of the trees wearing an old tattered coat and carrying a huge dirty bag full of rags and half-eaten fruits. She walked slowly because the bag weighed her down. Finally, she reached me. I tried to help her with her bundle, but she pushed me aside. She made a nest of fallen leaves and picked me up and sat me on the cushioned ground. The leaves overhead shifted, and in their movement, I heard the words floating in the air. Look and learn and remember and take what you will. The lady spread open the front of her coat, and immediately the clearing was aglow with light. Colors flashed all around her, illuminating her figure. The jewels and mirrors and sparkling stone that lined her coat suspended her in changing colors. There were tiny bells making tinny sounds and colored beads and dancing patterns on the cloth, and her bag was now full of painted eggs. Most people see the tears and the dirt and the dull colors of my coat, and they smell only the stench of the old and dying. But a few, a selected few, will see the colors and hear their songs. They have the patience to wait and the imagination to see. You must learn to recognize these. Start with the eyes and work your way inside. Stop here and look into their hearts. And when you are ready, only when you are sure, you open your coat and let them see your jewels. Let them hear your songs and let them see you shine. The next time we had show and tell homework, I asked my mom for something special to take to school. The following day, I took in her stethoscope. It felt hard and cold all the way to school, and I forgot how to pronounce the name. But everybody loved this new toy. I got a gold star for my presentation. Miss Santini smiled broadly and said, "Excellent." My classmates and even Miss Santini took turns listening to each other's heart and passing the instrument around. I sat in my seat and watched them. The teacher beamed, the class was very impressed, and I had learned my lesson. Thank you. So I will stop here, and you can ask questions or make comments or whatever. Yes.
Yeah, from Nigeria, Yoruba land. And I'm so intrigued that you mentioned Fela.
Mm-hmm.
That's the big musician in Nigeria before he died in 1999.
Mm-hmm.
I've never met him before. How his name come into your tool?
I never met that person. The name came because when I was looking to name African characters, I went to a naming book and tried to find a name that was African but also Latino, so that her name would not be changed. Because if she had had an obviously African name that didn't sound right to the plantation owners, they would have changed her name. And I wanted her to keep her name. Yes. No other questions? Yes, in the back.
It's interesting to note that her past, the last story you just mentioned, how she kind of lost a little bit of herself and her culture and her heritage because of the teacher. So it's kind of like a modernization, which is a lot of times about what our students go through when they go into preschool and when they go into elementary school, how the teachers take a language away from them if they're not taught in a bilingual education system. You know, how they lose those stories and that history and that past, and that excerpt really did hit that point on the head.
Thank you. Yes.
What was the motivation for you to write this type of novel, fiction novel, as opposed to other ideas you may have had?
Okay, there are a number of things. One of the things was that when I was a child, I was sent to Puerto Rico to live with my grandparents because our neighborhood in the Bronx had gotten really bad and my parents were afraid that I would get hurt. So they sent us to live with my grandparents. And I had many cousins. This was a totally new experience for me, going from urban New York City to rural Puerto Rico. But one of my chores was I had to braid my great-grandmother's hair before she went to bed. And all the female cousins took turn doing this. And what I noticed is she had dead straight hair down to her, buttocks. And she was very light-skinned. And I'm thinking, okay, there's got to be somebody white in here, but who? Because there didn't seem to be anybody white in the family. And so as I got older, of course, as a child, I wasn't going to say, Grandma, how come you look half white? But as I got older, I started wondering, what happened? And especially because this woman, who was a widow, had 11 children, and she left a farm to each one. So where did she get that land, So I figured the only way it could have happened is if some white person gave her the land. Now, why would that be? So that's when I started going backwards and using my imagination to figure out a situation where that could happen. And so I'm not going to tell you how she got it, but that's one of the reasons that I wrote this. Another reason that I wrote this book is because I was an English major in college, and all through school, I worked in the library. I loved reading. I read all these books, and in all these books, I never found anybody who looked like me, not even close. When I got to college, we read, for the first time, Down These Mean Streets by Piri Thomas. First Puerto Rican novelist I ever heard of. But the characters in his novels still didn't behave like the people that I knew. They didn't have the same, while we shared many of the same cultural issues, we didn't have the same life. So I complained and complained and complained. And boy, did I complain. And then finally somebody said to me, instead of complaining, why don't you write it? And one of the issues that was being debated at that time was who to best tell your story. Isn't it better for you to tell your story than for you to expect somebody else to tell your story? So these are like two major reasons why this book came about. Yes?
I was going to ask, I know the book is more designed for adults, but you had also mentioned that you had been a young adult librarian, and
Yes.
so I wondered if you thought at all about a young adult audience when you were writing this, or?
Yes. I did. I think it would have to be an older young adult, like juniors or seniors in high school. And although it can be read independently, on an independent level, I would prefer to see it done in a classroom because there are a lot of issues that, maybe a kid that age would just overlook. And I think one of the important things that I hope comes out of the book is a dialogue. And so this kind of situation is very important to me, where we exchange ideas and talk about some of the, and one of the reasons why I made her teacher Italian American and made her go into that whole speech is because there are stories in all cultures, and there are kind of magical things in all cultures that we never hear about because we are educated into believing that that's not real and that's not, you know, empirical, and therefore not as valid as. Anyone else? Yes. Oh, just a minute. I'll be right back to you. Mm-hmm.
I really liked the way you drew the the scene in the first excerpt you wrote,
Mhm.
the one 100 years ago of
Mhm.
the plantation.
Mhm.
And I wonder if you had to do any research, any historical research, for what that scene moment
Yes.
would have been like for people who experienced it.
Yes, I went back to Puerto Rico on a number of occasions, not just to visit my family, but you know, I grabbed a camera and went out in search for plantation ruins. I talked to people at the university, at the Center for Advanced Studies, about what we know of the life of slaves. And one of the answers I got, well, we really don't dwell on that part of our past. And it's like, why not? So part of my insistence in writing the book is because there wasn't enough information at the time. Now it turns out that there is. At that time, the only information that was available was primarily records of ship captains, laws and regulations put forth by the Spanish government, the abolition papers, that kind of thing. But there was really nothing from a black voice speaking. And so I just went out and looked for old black people. And I talked to my grandmother and her friends. And there's a story in here about, and that story happens to be true, about my getting sick and going to Puerto Rico to be nursed by my grandmother and her throwing out all my prescriptions. And all her friends, you know, all these octogenarians would like come and visit me every day. And there was nothing for us to do but talk. So they would tell me all their stories. And my grandmother said, be careful, she's writing all this down, you know. But so one of the things that I encourage people to do is to talk to their elders and get those stories. Because when I was a kid, I was like every other kid. It's like, oh, Grandma, I heard this story 50 million times. I'm dying here. But when she was gone, you know, those stories sustained me. And so on my website, there is a section for my readers to share their ancestor stories so that they don't die out and so that they're preserved somewhere. Yes?
Okay. Curiously wanted to know whether this is your first novel or whether it is from like poetry or short stories. Secondly, who's your favorite writer now, in Africa or in diaspora?
Uh-huh. Okay, the first question is, have I written anything before? This is my first novel, but I've written many short stories, memoir pieces, travel pieces, some published in South African journals, some published here in the United States. Two of my stories are in a book called Chicken Soup for the Latino Soul. And there are other publications. But again, if you go to my website, and it's www and my last name, Llanos-Figueroa.com, and there's a complete list of my publications in there. Okay. And the second question was, who is my favorite author at the time, at the moment? Right now, I'm reading a book in Spanish called La Isla Bajo el Mar, which will be translated. It's by Isabel Allende. She writes in Spanish first, and then it's translated into English. And it's the translation for the title is The Island Under the Sea, and it is about a slave woman in the Dominican Republic who is brought to New Orleans. And I'm particularly fascinated about this issue of Africans living in Latin America who are then transported to the United States. Because you have to acculturate to that culture in Latin America first, and that language, and then you have to do it all over again when you come to the United States. So that whole trajectory to me is fascinating. It bespeaks of a strength that I don't think has been acknowledged yet. That's in Spanish. In English, probably Toni Morrison is my favorite writer. Her last book, A Mercy, is also a different look at slavery. We're not looking now at slavery in terms of they done us wrong as much as how did we survive this experience? Not blaming or taking blame away where it's necessary, but a look at just how do you survive this situation? And that can be transferred to how did Jews survive pogroms in Russia, or how did North Africans survive during World War II, or whatever. Every culture has its own horror story. So how do we get through it as people? Yes, ma'am.
You thought of translating this book into Spanish?
I thought of it. Right now my agent is in Germany at the translating fair where foreign language rights are sold. There seems to be an interest in Spain and in Germany. I'm very concerned about the translation in Spanish, however, because I want it translated into not Castilian, but the language of the people. And as a librarian, I went out one time and spent all this money buying The Color Purple in translation, and they had translated it into Castilian Spanish. Nobody read the book because it doesn't make sense that these characters would speak with that language. It just doesn't make sense. So that's the long answer. The short answer is yes, I've thought about it. It's more complicated than what it appears to be. So we'll see. Yes.
But with the translation question, isn't there the added dimension of Puerto Rican New York Spanish, like?
That's a whole other thing.
Yeah. And Spaniard de gracia.
Yes.
And how do you?
Yeah, that's a whole other thing. What I'm hoping is that that the Spanish will translate it for their folks and let, for instance, a Puerto Rican publishing company translate it for Latin America. I don't know if people will do that because when it comes to money, people don't share very well. So I don't know. Any other questions?
Question of language. Which one is displacing the other? Is it English or Spanish?
Which is what?
Which one is displacing other?
Which is displacing the other?
Yeah.
I would like to say that I'm equally bilingual. That's the ideal. But I am really English dominant. Spanish is my primary language in that it was the first language I spoke, but my education has been in the United States. So I function much better in it, certainly in terms of writing. However, whoever translates it will have to deal with my reading it in Spanish and say, oh no, that's not what I thought, or that's not what I meant. So I'm going to be a pain in the butt, I guess. I guess. So, any other questions? Yes.
Just curious how long you were writing the book, because you've made some allusions to, at the time that you were doing some of the research or versus now. So over what time period?
It took 20 years. When I started writing, I did not realize I was writing a novel. And I used people that I knew as patterns for some of my writing. So, for instance, one of the characters is patterned after my grandmother, and my grandmother died right in the middle of it. So for 3 years, I couldn't write about her. So, and also, I was a teacher and a librarian, and you can't do those things well and write, because they take up all your energy. You're drained by the time you get home. So I could only write on summer vacations. But it worked out well, because when I retired, then I could do this full time, and I was already up and running and had some things published already. Any other questions? How many people, I have a question, how many people had no idea that, that slavery happened in Puerto Rico? Oh, okay, everybody had that. The reason I asked that question is because as I was growing up, people, when they heard me speaking Spanish, they'd say, oh, you don't look Puerto Rican. And I said, well, what does a Puerto Rican look like? You know, that's like you don't look American. You know, what does that mean? And so they say, oh, well, your father's black and your mother's Puerto Rican. No. Your father's Puerto Rican and your mother's black. No. They are both black and they are both Puerto Rican. So somebody said to me, you should call the book, Funny You Don't Look Puerto Rican. But that's another little kernel of, you know, why write it, because so many people were not aware of the historical issue of slavery in Puerto Rico and certainly in the Caribbean as a whole. So.
How large is the population of that?
I'm sorry?
How large is the population of Puerto Rico?
How large is the population of Puerto Rico? I don't know, but the population of Puerto Rico is smaller than the population of Puerto Ricans in the United States. So if all of us decided to go home, the island would sink. So, yes.
Well, when you mentioned the ethnicity of Puerto Rican as opposed to black, in the last 10 years, there's also been the number of, on an application, sometimes you'll say there'll be non-Hispanic or black Hispanic, white Hispanic. So now that's kind of being more recognized in the last,
Yes.
last 10 years as far as
Yes.
ethnicity.
Yes.
Latin
Right. And years ago, for Black History Week, I would put up a picture of like Roberto Clemente, and people would say, well, he's not black, he's Puerto Rican. And I'd say, okay, look at this picture and tell me this man is not black, okay? So it's been a teaching experience on many levels for me. So. Any other questions? Well, I want to thank you very much for coming. And I think there's food in the back. And thank you.